Ibu oleh Dekan FKM Undip yang dalam hal ini akan diwakili oleh Kaprodi Magister Kesehatan Masyarakat, Ibu Dr. Anda Ayun Sriatmi, MKes. So, Professor Simon, before we will start with the opening speech from Ibu Dr. Ayun Sriatmi. Kepada Ibu Ayun, waktu dan tempat saya persilahkan.
Ya, terima kasih Mbak Dian. Good morning everyone. Good morning Prof. Simon Reid. Hello, Prof. Simon. How are you?
Morning. Very well. Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
Very pleased to be here.
Today, Prof. Simon Reid as our guest lecturer at the Public Health Master Study Program, Faculty of Public Health, Diponegoro University. Good morning also to Professor Marta Irin Kartasurya. Good morning, Prof. Marta, who in a few weeks ago was placed to invite Prof. Reid to give a lecture here. Thank you, Prof. Marta. Good morning, selamat pagi juga untuk Mbak Dian, Miss Nur Hadismandiar Nandini, who in this morning, she is the moderator and MC also, ya. Double job ya Mbak Dian, ya. And good morning to all our beloved lecturer and students of Master Study Program. Selamat pagi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, salam sehat dan salam sejahtera. Pagi ini saya diminta mewakili Pak Dekan dan pimpinan FKM Undip karena beliau-beliau sedang mengikuti kegiatan halal bihalal Universitas di Gedung Baru di Muladido. Sehingga saya diminta untuk mewakili membuka kegiatan kuliah dosen tamu dari Queensland University, khususnya dari The School of Public Health, di mana beliau, Prof. Simon Reid ini merupakan salah satu pakar kesehatan masyarakat, khususnya dalam kajian tentang berpikir sistem dalam kesehatan masyarakat. Selama ini beliau sudah cukup lama bertugas di The School of Public Health di University of Queensland, Australia, dan atas jasa Profesor Marta ini ya, beliau berhasil meyakinkan Prof. Reid untuk bergabung pada kegiatan kuliah dosen tamu prodi Magister MKM Undip ya. Today, on behalf of the Dean, as the leader of Public Health Faculty Universitas Diponegoro University, who cannot to attend personally, my name Ayun Sriatmi, as the head of the Public Health Master Study Program, was asked to represent him to open and give a speech. As we know that understanding system and system approach is a strategy for managing organization, including a health organization, of course, to be more effective and more efficient. A systemic approach is also a specific step to understand systems better and step to deal with a complex problems too, including the organizational and environmental problems. I think system thinking is a way of looking at all reality, all facts, and help us to understand how system work and how system affect the quality of our lives. System thinking in public health is a key competency or main skill for manager or health professionals because it can provide a broad picture, provide a broad figure for manager or health professional about something by considering how change in one area will impact other areas, especially when we are concerned about existing health problems or issues about health resources, challenge advance in health technology, behavioral barriers, and so on, etc. that occur in society and organization. In principle, system thinking will always be related to the interdependency that occurs between one another. It is certainly very interesting for all of us to understand as how we can develop the concept of thinking systematically to be able to make the right decision according to our field or our duty or our field of work so far, we realized that it is not easy to apply the concept of system thinking in the reality of life and in the management of health organization or health service organizations when our knowledge is still very limited. Therefore, we hope that Professor Simon Reid can provide us a clear explanation of all aspects related to strategies improving our ability to think systematically. Thank you, Prof. Reid. Kuliah ini tentu saja sangat bermanfaat, teman-teman, ya, karena kami semua berharap semua mahasiswa dan kita semua tentu saja mendapatkan materi dan penjelasan yang sangat gamblang dan benar-benar jelas serta dapat dipahami bagaimana menerjemahkan konsep berpikir sistem dalam kehidupan sehari-hari. Karena ini kadang-kadang nggak mudah, ya, mudah diucapkan tapi susah diimplementasikan. Oleh karena itu nanti kami harap silakan perkuliahan tamu ini, dosen tamu ini dimanfaatkan sebanyak-banyaknya untuk bertanya. Jangan takut banyak bertanya, boleh bertanya menggunakan bahasa Indonesia ya Mbak Diar ya, karena nanti akan dibantu diterjemahkan oleh moderator. Silakan dimanfaatkan sebaik-baiknya ya. Thank you for Professor Simon Reid for giving your time to us to explaining how system thinking in the public health sector as the main topic or main subject of our guest lecture or our visiting lecture today. This is a very interesting and relevant topics to us, so that we really appreciate your presence here. Even we met in Zoom meeting, right? Yeah, even we meet online, but I hope we hope that someday we can meet offline, of course. All of us are very happy with your presence. Thank you again for Mr. Reid. Thank you also to the moderator, Mbak Diar. Please help to organize the discussion and also translate it in general. Yeah. Participants can ask many questions. Please do not be afraid to ask because later all questions will be answered by Professor Reid. Is that right, Professor?
Yep.
Thank you. Okay. That is the speech that I gave on behalf of the Dean of Faculty of Public Health, and finally, with saying Thanksgiving to God, the event of guest lecture today, our visiting lecture today, with the topic System Thinking of Public Health, and with the guest speaker, Professor Simon Reid from the School of Public Health, Queensland University, was declared open officially. Thank you very much for our speaker, Prof. Reid, for moderator, for Prof. Martha, and for all of participants to your participation, and enjoy the lecture materials and discussions well. Once again, thank you. Demikian, terima kasih dan semoga bermanfaat. Saya tutup dengan wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Tetap sehat dan tetap semangat. Monggo, Bu Diar, atur nuwun.
Okay, thank you very much, Bu Ayun, for the great opening speech. So before we start to the main session, let me introduce first for Professor Simon Reid. So Professor Simon Reid is a professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Queensland. He is a keen advocate of One Health and the application of system thinking approaches. So that's why our topic today is about system thinking in public health. And he's also he's also have a lot of research before related to One Health and also related to animal and public health and health security. And he's graduated from the James Cook University in Australia for his PhD. And in Professor Simon's CV, we see that he has a lot of experiences related to One Health and also related to animal health and also about system thinking. Without further ado, we will listen about the topic about the health system thinking in public health today. So for all of the students, please don't hesitate. If you have any questions for Professor Simon, you can write it in the chat meeting, or you can raise your hand later on the discussion section. And as Bu Ayun said before, don't be afraid if you want to ask in Bahasa Indonesia. I will help you to translate it to Professor Simon. So I think we can start. Professor Simon, the time is yours.
Okay. Terima kasih Mbak dan Ibu. Dan selamat pagi dan rekan-rekan dan mahasiswa. Saya minta maaf atas bahasa Indonesia saya yang buruk. Saya tinggal di Makassar bertahun-tahun yang lalu, tetapi saya lupa bahasa Indonesia
That's
saya.
perfect.
Yeah, so I apologize. I should know more. Now I'd like to start in the language I can communicate to you in. But thank you for welcoming me to this seminar. I was very, very pleased to host Martha, and we had a wonderful 2 weeks together. So I'm pleased that some of my other colleagues are also able to present seminars and begin communication and some cooperation between our faculties. So I see that we have a large number of people. I won't ask if anyone can tell me their experiences in systems thinking. So this will be two-way if people are willing to ask questions. And I do encourage questions. So what I'll cover is to talk a bit about what systems thinking is, and then a little bit about how we do systems thinking, and then give you some case studies that will explain, I hope, some of the features of what can be achieved using system thinking tools. So the first thing is to then cover what system thinking is. And I think it's important to also note, particularly, I guess, for my academic colleagues, is that we now include system thinking formally in our teaching, primarily because it is now a competency of the public health workforce. And this was identified by the World Health Organization recently. So when we design our curriculum, we design to ensure that systems thinking is included. So that's been an interesting change. So the first thing we have to think a bit about is what a system is. The thinking part, I think, is a bit easier to understand, but the system. So this is a definition of a system. It's a series of interrelated or interdependent parts that interact to form a whole system. And I've got an example here of the carbon cycle, the carbon dioxide cycle. And this, I think, when I studied biology, it was called the carbon cycle. But essentially, what this represents is a series of elements. So these are a series of parts of the system, so plants, animals, and soils, and then arrows that connect those together that demonstrate the relationships. And so this is the type of image that we want to finish our activities with, so that we understand the picture, the whole picture. We don't just understand one part of the picture. A system can be any set of components. Systems thinking developed from engineering and business studies. So largely it's come into health from the basis of mostly businesses. And businesses are mostly made up of people. So a large number of our systems that we study are human systems. So they're systems that are created by humans, and the problems that we experience are caused largely by the actions and the beliefs of the humans in the system. So what I'd like to do is start with a topic about birds, because we'll talk a lot about humans. And the reason for this is it's a nice case study to illustrate, I guess, what we're trying to achieve when we start to think about systems thinking. So Macquarie Island is a small island. Is actually part of Australia, but it's a long way from Australia. It's about 1,500 kilometres south of Tasmania, which is the island on the south of Australia. It's a very small island, and it has a very large number of birds that visit every year. So it's a very, very important part of the ecosystem supporting these birds. So on a map, you can see it's right down the bottom. So it's a long way from anywhere. But in the 1800s, in the 19th century, Macquarie Island was a very important place where people who were engaged in whaling and also engaged in the sealing, so taking seals from the environment and I guess killing them for their meat, their fat, and their skins. And so as a result, the island population of animals increased because people introduced into the island cats and rabbits, rats and mice, which for an ecosystem that's isolated can be quite disastrous. So feral cats, so these are cats that are domestic cats that are now wild. We use the term feral. Feral cats had a devastating effect on the population. So they were killing the seabirds that were coming to Macquarie Island from very long distances in order to nest and to undergo a really critical part of their life cycle. And so the decision was then made to begin a program of eradication. This is in 1985, a program of eradication began to eliminate the feral cats. So by the turn of the century, all the cats had been removed. So for this program, this was a huge success. So the question we have then is, what do we think? So the feral cats were removed. The logic. So if we think about this program, and for some of the students, hopefully you've done some monitoring and evaluation training. So we think about program logic. So the logic is that the feral cats are bad. The feral cats are bad. If we eliminate the feral cats, we stop them eating, killing birds, and we will solve our problem. So the question is, were the seabirds saved? So this is a picture from Macquarie Island. It's clearly very different to where you're currently living now. It's it's full of grasses. Not much grows there because it's very close to Antarctica. So this is halfway through the program. This is 5 years after the program was successful, and the question is, what do we see? We see quite a substantial difference between when the feral cats were present and afterwards. Now, this is actually quite an important problem because we can see that the grasses are missing. Those grasses are habitat for the birds. So the birds nest amongst the grasses, and if there are no grasses, they cannot nest. So this was a problem. So essentially, the elements of the Macquarie Island problem that we were focusing on the immediate symptom. So the problem that we identified was that birds were being killed by cats. So when we think in linear terms, so when we think in cause and effect, cats are bad because they eat birds. Therefore, if we remove the cats, we remove the problem that we're seeing. What we don't take into account is that cats also eat rabbits, and rabbits were present on Macquarie Island, and rabbits. So if you get rid of cats, you then remove the source of you remove the cats, which removes the control mechanism for rabbit populations. The problem then is that rabbits eat grass, and the cause of the damage that we saw was due to the rabbits. So essentially, what happened was that we ignored, when the designers of the program designed it, they were focused entirely on the relationship between cats and birds, They weren't focused on the fact that there were rabbits present and that there was a relationship between rabbits and cats. And then there was an invisible relationship. So this relationship that exists associated with the habitat is not visible. It was only visible when the cats were removed and the population of rabbits grew very, very large. So if we were looking at this as a systems thinking exercise in planning, then what we would hope is that we can change the way that we design our future programs, particularly in this case, by considering the cat as part of a system. And if we were to look at the Macquarie Island system, we would include rats, mice, birds, habitat, and rabbits. And we would consider how they were related and what might happen if we intervene and change one part of the system. So I wanted to just quickly also show you a very short video just to illustrate a health problem that we can think about. And I just need to ask to make sure that the audio for this is coming through. So perhaps someone could let me know. Oops, what's happened there? Sorry, is the audio okay?
No, there is no audio coming out from the videos.
Not coming through.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure how I make that possible.
Maybe when you click share screen, you can click the option audio sound in the.
So.
Or maybe you can send us the link of the video. I will help you to share.
Okay. Yeah, okay, I'll do that because this. So, mate, I can stop screen sharing if you like. Is that working?
Could you stop your share screen for a moment, Professor? Okay, thank you. Sorry.
In the 1950s, the Dayak people of Borneo, an island in Southeast Asia, were suffering from an outbreak of malaria, so they called the World Health Organization for help. The World Health Organization had a ready-made solution, which was to spray copious amounts of DDT around the island. With the application of DDT, the mosquitoes that carried the malaria were knocked down, and so was the malaria. There were some interesting side effects, though. The first was that the roofs of people's houses began to collapse on their heads. Turns out the DDT not only killed off the malaria-carrying mosquitoes, but it also killed a species of parasitic wasp that had controlled a population of thatch-eating caterpillars. Thatch being what the roofs of the Dayak people's homes were made from. Without the wasps, the caterpillars multiplied and flourished and began munching their way through the villagers' roofs. That was just the beginning. The DDT affected a lot of the island's other insects, which were eaten by the resident population of small lizards called geckos. The biological half-life of DDT is around 8 years, so animals like geckos do not metabolize it very fast. It stays in their system for a long time. Over time, the geckos began to accumulate pretty high levels of DDT, and while they tolerated the DDT fairly well, the island's resident cats, which dined on the geckos, did not. The cats ate the geckos, and the DDT contained in the geckos killed the cats. With the cats gone, the island's population of rats came out to play. We all know what happens when rats multiply and flourish. Pretty soon the Dayak people were back on the phone to the World Health Organization, only this time it wasn't malaria that was the problem. It was the plague and the destruction of their grain stores, both of which were caused by the overpopulation of rats. This time, though, the World Health Organization didn't have a ready-made solution and had to invent one. What did they do? They decided to parachute live cats into Borneo. Operation Cat Drop occurred courtesy of the Royal Air Force and eventually stabilized the situation.
Thank you. So now we have two quite different stories, I guess, both involving cats, but with different types of outcomes. And I think the moral of the story is when we have complex systems, if we don't try and think about the whole system, when we start trying to fix the problems, we may actually make them worse, or we may create other problems. And we see that quite often. We certainly in Australia are seeing a big problem with vaping, with e-cigarette use in young children. And probably the root of the problem is the way that we manage tobacco access, as well as some of the messages that have come from the health sector about the safety of e-cigarettes. So to some extent, vaping is another good example. There's a number of books. I didn't provide a list of references in the back, but I can provide a list to later on, because anybody who's interested, there's a few books that are worth reading. But basically the other one is you can't start fiddling, you can't meddle, you can't intervene in one part of a complex system without setting off unintended consequences. And so what we try and do, so the point of systems thinking is that we start where we are now. So where we are generally, and most of what you as students will learn, and myself as an academic have learned, is we learn the mechanistic viewpoint. So mechanistic viewpoints is really a reductionist approach. So this is traditionally how we manage, how we try and understand our lives and how we understand our environment. So epidemiology is a very good example of a mechanistic discipline. It seeks to break problems down, to look at variables, factors, associations. And what we tend to want to do is we want to look for cause and effect. So we want to look at the cat and the bird. And what we try and then do is mitigate. So we mitigate cause and effect. So we do what we did with the bird. We eliminate the cause, we eliminate the cats, or we basically try and try and accept and live with the problem. So when we then move towards systems thinking, so to take a systemic view, we need to focus on the principles and the relationships within the system. And we need to understand that the interactions between the parts of the system become more important than the actual parts themselves. So I like to think of it in terms of, in a public health way, is that epidemiology will tell you how a problem is generated and what the factors are. So we can develop a model, a risk factor model for a particular problem that tells you what the parts of the system are, but it doesn't tell you how they associate, how they relate to each other. The other thing that we struggle to do with our mechanistic viewpoints is to be more specific about our complexity, because we tend to be looking for quantitative relationships. So in epidemiology, we need to be able to measure a variable in order to include it in our analysis. So what we tend to do is we tend to assume and we reduce the complexity so that we can perform an analysis. The other thing that we lose when we do that is the dynamic nature. And so by that dynamic, we simply mean the change over time. So we can perform time series analysis, but we don't understand through those processes how each of the different parts of the system are changing differently over time and how they influence each other. So what we want to do is focus on how the process of change works, not so much what the changes are, but how the process actually works. So this diagram was provided in a paper recently, and I find this one quite useful because essentially what we're attempting to do, as I said, with epidemiology is focus on the parts. What we're interested in are the connections. And so really they're not, one does not make the other obsolete. So system science isn't basically trying to make other approaches obsolete. We absolutely require data on variables. It's a system, it's a process of it's an adjunct. So the reason that systems thinking is important is that we're looking for what systems thinking people call policy resistance. And so policy resistance is an example of something where you get an unintended consequence, where you get an outcome that you didn't expect. And so we then work with feedback loops. And so we have simple feedback loops everywhere through life. And the way we characterize these is with arrows and polarities. So this is a positive. So basically, the more eggs we have, the more chickens we have, the more chickens we have, the more eggs we have. So these generally in dynamic terms give you exponential curves. If we look at a balancing loop, the more chickens we have, the more chickens crossing the road. The more chickens crossing the road, the more chickens are likely to be killed by cars, so therefore fewer chickens. And what you'll see is a decline over time. And this is also the dynamics that occurs with births and deaths. So births is a reinforcing loop. Your death rate is a balancing loop. So essentially, your population growth is the outcome of the relationships between these two loops. So basically, our population of chickens, for example, is a balance between the number of eggs produced and the number of chickens crossing roads. So I just want to go through another example to look at, I guess, well-intentioned but unintended consequences. And so this one relates to birth rates. And so in the 1960s in Romania, which was then part of the USSR, there was a very low birth rate, and there were concerns that this was a problem because without sufficient births, the economy becomes stagnant. So they basically decided that they would force people to have more children. So they banned contraception. They began a campaign to promote large families. They provided tax incentives. They banned abortions. So what happened then? So it's interesting. Today we were discussing in there's an article in Australia's program press about tax incentives, because Australia did exactly this in 2004. And the same sort of thing happened in Australia. We had a very rapid increase in birth rates as a result of a tax incentive. And in this situation, this is a fourfold increase in birth rates in Romania, almost a fourfold increase. But over time, that increase then turned to a decrease far below the level that it was at the beginning of the period. So the question is, what happened? So basically everything that was designed to happen should have happened. And so this is where we begin to think about systems. So the system, not just individuals, but collectively, the system responded in ways that the government didn't anticipate. So they didn't think that this would happen. The factors that led to this, and if you start to think about how these relate to each other as well, is that people began to practice alternative methods of birth control. Contraceptives were smuggled across the border, so the demand was still there, so an illegal supply was established. Women sought out abortions to manage their fertility, and also the number of young babies, neonatal deaths rose. So essentially the population tried to manage the size of their families using the tools that they had available to them. So the underlying problem the government didn't understand was that people didn't want large families. The reason they didn't want large families is they couldn't afford large families. So the government didn't prevent them from having small families. They managed their own fertility in order to achieve a smaller family. But at the same time, they became very resentful against the government. And it was part of the movement that led to the fall of the government and the fall of the USSR, the Soviet states. So that wasn't the only problem. There were other consequences. So many unwanted children, because of the particularly single mothers giving birth, were placed in orphanages. They became crowded, food became scarce, and they began to use blood transfusions as nutritional supplements. Blood transfusions then led to an AIDS epidemic because of needle reuse. So it is interesting. The orphanages in Romania were very high profile. I visited Romania once in 1992 for a holiday, and there were people coming on holiday with suitcases full of clothing to give to people, to give to the orphanages. So it was a severe problem that the whole of Europe was responding to. So all of this occurred because of one decision, and that one decision was that we wanted a particular goal, but didn't consider what the system, what the people within the system would do. So the best, and this is where we, if we focus on mechanistic viewpoints, we will tend to look at the causes or the solutions that are closest to the problem. And those we think are the best options. It's interesting as well with systems thinking is that often it's not about finding the best option. It's about finding the least worst option, because when we're dealing with a complex problem, by definition, there are no solutions. There are no correct answers. What we can do is become more confident in understanding what some of the problems might be that we might generate. And it's a bit like the Macquarie Island example, where we created a problem where there wasn't a problem before. And it's usually because the problem was there, but it was being hidden by other parts of the system. The other important part of systems thinking are these feedbacks. So feedback loops, which is what we talked about with chickens and road crossings, they become very important. So the aim of systems thinking is to move away from a linear way of thinking, and this is pretty much the way that all of our programs are planned, to a view that focuses on feedbacks and focuses on interconnections. So what we need to do is we need to deal with complexity, and we need to think about the way that the complexity is driving issues that require us to work with different stakeholders. So one of the ways that we, certainly in our public health teaching, and particularly with One Health, is we use systems thinking to help us understand the drivers of a problem, but also to help us understand the stakeholders. And the reason for that is we really do need to work out how to show stakeholders what their role in the system is, and also to show them what they need to do to change. And the issue with silos, I hope everyone understands silos. It's one of these topics that comes up a lot, where we talk about staying within our areas of specialization. And what's important about system thinking is it helps you see the connections between the silos. So it won't tell you that you need to remove the divisions between sectors and disciplines, but it talks about how to work together. There's another interesting tool that we implement, certainly in the training that we do, is to use this concept of a sort of a systematic approach to collaboration. So this is a table drawn from this particular publication. Again, I'm happy to share some of these. The reason I show this is that one of the outcomes of systems thinking is to better understand how we get different groups of people to work together. And we often use the word collaboration when we actually mean something else. So by understanding what it is we're trying to achieve as an outcome, so do we need people to work together within their own institutional frameworks? So do they already have activities and we simply can achieve our outcomes if they work together so that they're doing activities at the same time, or they make a common message, provide a common message? If we understand that, we can then begin to work towards a coordinated activity. So I've worked with a number of end user organizations, particularly in the Pacific region, and this is one of the areas where they see value in thinking about these structures. So that's sort of what we should be doing, or can or can't or attempt to do. And this is a bit more about how we do it. And without, I guess, sort of using terms like saying this is really difficult, because it's a lot easier to perform an epidemiological analysis than it is to perform a systems modeling exercise. But essentially, even going the first step of recognizing and understanding some of the system structures is usually enough to help people understand the consequences of decisions that have been made or decisions that they may make. You can then go on to different levels. So we then begin to use modeling to start to formally structure and model our system, and I can show you some examples of that. And then we begin to expand models to different levels. So most of the work that I've done with organizations has been focused on this, the first part of understanding system structures. So the types of things we can do are quite accessible. This is a training workshop on rat control, so rodent control, and we did this as part of a leptospirosis project in Fiji. These are rich pictures. So this is basically the output of a group of participants who were looking at the ecology, so the rat system, the rodent system, in different settings, in order to work out where they should locate their trapping sites to get the best understanding of the population. But essentially what they've done is they've looked at the drivers of the rat population. So they've looked at where there are sheltered areas, where there's food sources, and where rats may be living and breeding. So these types of pictures are quite useful. This clearly identifies two different contexts and the differences that have to be taken into account. The other thing that we use increasingly, and we've been using this in our teaching this semester, is the systems thinking iceberg. And so what this does is it helps us understand some of the levels of the system structure. And so what we've been doing is using this as a beginning of a conversation about the system structure. And the point of the iceberg is that the first part of the iceberg is the visible part, and this is the event or the problem that you are observing. So if we take the example of increased antibiotic resistance, this is the data, this is where our epidemiology sits. So we're measuring the prevalence or the incidence of antibiotic resistance. So this is what we think the problem is, and this is what we think the causes are. So this is the next level down at where there are some visible factors and some not so visible. So some of the factors we develop our understanding through inference, others we can measure directly. So again, this is where our factor analysis and some of the outputs of our epidemiological or even qualitative research might come in. So this is looking at explaining why there's an increase. So how does the increase come about? We have increasing prescription, we have increasing access. So straightforward. Then we start to try and answer the question of why. So why do we have these visible causes? You know, why do we have an increased prescription? Why do we have increased access? And so some of the factors, and these are the factors that may be provided by an economic analysis or a qualitative study. So the low cost of antibiotics, there's pressure on doctors to prescribe antibiotics, and there's pressure from pharmaceutical companies for doctors to prescribe. So those are some of the system structures. So they're some of the explanations. But then sitting beneath that are our beliefs and our assumptions. And we also call this our mental model. And this is what is driving the system. So if people think that antibiotics cure everything, viruses included, then they're much more likely to put pressure on their doctor whenever they feel sick. Antibiotics are safe means that they don't think there's a problem with putting pressure on their doctor. My doctor is negligent. If they don't give me a prescription, means that I'm more likely to go seeking another doctor. So I will keep asking a doctor until I finally get my prescription. So this is the type of exercise we use to just help people think through that sort of series of levels of system structure. And then what we can do is begin to draw basic small systems models. And you saw the chicken and egg model. These are outputs generated by my students. So this is an exercise we did in an infectious disease course looking at COVID vaccination. So in this situation, we draw a circle with our factors around it, and we join them together. And these are direct. So we look at direct relationships and whether or not they're one leads to an increase in the other, or an increase in one leads to a decrease in the other. So this is where the pluses and the minuses come in. So with these, we can begin to understand how things relate. So this, the one on the left in the middle here is looking at obesity as an outcome. And then the one on the right is focused on diabetes. And so you'll begin to see these were done fairly quickly, and we were intentionally wanting to limit what people could do. But you can see if you follow and what these are doing is helping you tell the story of how this problem occurs. So in this situation, green space, so this is access to open parklands. If we increase the amount of green space, there's a plus, so we increase the amount of physical activity people do. If we increase the physical activity, there's a minus, we decrease the number of cases of diabetes. If people have more time, so if they're working less, they will have more time for physical activity, so that goes up, and then diabetic cases go down. At the same time, if they have more time, they may have a healthier diet because they'll cook in their homes more, and that will also reduce diabetes. But again, if people don't work much, then they may not have much income, that might reduce their available money, which reduces their capacity to buy healthy food, which might increase their diabetes. So that is the use of these tools. So the other one we talked about was stock and flow models, and this is when we begin to get into a mathematical simulation model. And essentially, if we look back here at cases of diabetes, they're essentially a stock. So a stock is like a bathtub, and it's a place where you get an accumulation. So in our system, the amount of water in the bath would represent the number of cases of diabetes, and the inflows are like these arrows. So these are the flows that's what's filling the bath up. So basically, they're the risk factors, and the little tap on this inlet is modifiable according to factors such as income. So if we have more income, we reduce the inflow. If we have less income, the inflow might increase. And the outflow is what happens to individuals in this bathtub. So with diabetic cases, the outflow represents mortality. It represents good case management. So if we're looking at the consequences, we're interested in the outflows. And these can look complicated. There's a link down here to a community page for one of the software modeling, and there's a lot of COVID models. There are models for a lot of different health conditions, and you can play with those models, and you can change factors. So we can change the rate at which people use protective behaviours to avoid COVID, for example. If we increase protective behaviours, we change the transmission rate, which affects this little tap, and that changes the flow from people who are not infected through to people who are exposed to COVID, to coronavirus. So to show you a bit about how that works, and I am mindful of time, dear. If we're running out of time, can you let me know, and I can shorten.
No, it's okay. You still have time. It's fine.
Okay, thank you. So this is the outcome of a study of a student of mine who was interested in understanding brucellosis. So brucellosis, I think hopefully everyone knows, is caused by the infection with Brucella bacteria. There are different sources, so there are different species of Brucella, so Brucella melitensis, abortus, suis, and canis, and they associate with different animal groups. In Jordan, it's in the Middle East. In the Middle East has the highest rate of brucellosis in the world, and Jordan has one of the highest rates in the Middle East. And it's mainly associated with Brucella melitensis from goats and sheep, which are the primary source of animal protein. There was another issue in the system that he was interested in, which was the Syrian refugee crisis that occurred after the civil war that began in 2011, 2012, where Jordan took in 600,000 Syrian refugees into across its borders. And it coincides with this steep and sustained increase in the incidence of brucellosis. So you can see the system has this oscillation. There are these peaks and troughs, and essentially what that tells us is that there are competing forces in the system that are trying to increase the rate, and there are forces that are trying to decrease it. And the balance between those is what drives this oscillation between the high and the low. They also have very low rates of vaccination in sheep and goats. That's their primary source of control. So the veterinary services attempt to vaccinate the whole country, and very high rates of prevalence, 22% in animals. So if we look at what the World Health Organization says about Brucella, is that basically immunization of goats and sheep, so vaccination is the most important aspect. So prevention for humans is based on surveillance and prevention of risk factors. So that includes exposure to pregnant and animals shortly after birth, and also consumption of unpasteurized dairy products. The most effective prevention strategy is to eliminate infections, which is what Australia did at a huge cost. Vaccination of animals is recommended, but if you have very low prevalence, and Jordan doesn't, so 22% is not low, you can test and you can basically kill or remove the animals that are positive. And so again, primarily we're focused on public health measures, so food safety, occupational health, and public communication. So if we think about those as the ways that we approach this problem, because it's seen as purely a problem where people are exposed to animals, so the process we took was to then look at what the system actually looked like. And so we had systems, we had a Ministry of Agriculture, so we had the system related to animals and the animal disease. We had the services structure in the animal health system. We had the human system, which includes humans and the public health responses. And then there are the control sectors attempting to manage the problem. And then there's the livestock producers. So this is the owners, the growers, the traders, but also the producers of dairy products. So already you can see that it's a relatively complex system. So Haitham, my student, generated this diagram. This is a high-level diagram of his system model. So this is the same as my students were doing, the causal loop diagram. And basically what he was able to do, he did a series of interviews to get the data for this with people in Jordan that represented each of the major parts of the system. And we begin to see that the way that the veterinary services is established is through the veterinary clinic. That's the interface. That's the way that people who own animals and people who have the vaccine interact with each other. And there's a complex relationship that involves trust. So trust is a very important part of the attractiveness of the veterinary clinics. But then when you think about the human side, it's very small. So there's really only a couple of factors associated with human infection. And then we have some responses that sit in the detection system. And as soon as we begin to explore the actual animal production and the animal control sectors, particularly in Jordan, there's an issue with the cross-border. So they have a lot of illegal movement across the border. They have a system where vaccines are provided in response to problems, not or in response to a visit by an owner, a sheep owner, to a veterinary clinic. And then we have the biology. So this is the actual infection transmission within sheep herds. And then there's a trading system which is responsible for moving infected animals and mixing them together. So it becomes very complicated. But what we can do is we can then begin, once we identify this, to actually see who are the important people, who are the important organizations in the system. So this is just another representation, but it begins to show you the complexity of the mathematics when we begin to think about the modeling. And this is one section. So this is just the human infection section where people move through from being uninfected through to having infection and recovering, and whether they're symptomatic or not. So this is essentially the types of representations, and these models generate a series of differential mathematical equations which help us to understand the outcomes. What we do is we then simulate the population with the data that's available that tells us what happens now. So the simulation matches reasonably closely, so we are confident the model works. And then we begin to explore which variables are actually making a difference to the model. And we do a sensitivity analysis. And so in this situation, we can start to see that removing infected sheep and restricting trading, encouraging a relationship between vets and animal owners are quite influential. What we also begin to see is that the vaccination program in Jordan for animals is largely not a particularly sensitive part of the model. So we use that to then construct interventions and then simulate those interventions. So there's one thing that this process does is it begins to also tell us about how to explain the problem. So what we then find out is that there are different ways of measuring it. So if we look at the total number of cases in humans, that's one measure over time. The other one is how many cases occur in any given period of time. So the amplitude of an outbreak or an increase. We can also understand the prevalence in sheep and the number of abortions. So abortion is a symptom, is a clinical sign in sheep of infection, and it is a loss of production. So it's very expensive to a farmer to have an animal abort the young kid because it's a loss of production. And then if we work through these interventions, we can see at the beginning, so the bottom of this table on the right, enhanced immunity, which is the two vaccination programs that are currently being used by the government, make no measurable change to any of the parameters. If we try and encourage more people to visit vets, that doesn't help. If we try and raise awareness amongst people who are at risk, that also doesn't help particularly well. It's really not until we start to explore restricting markets, restricting the movement of animals, and focusing on reducing infection rates more purposely in sheep. So the most effective one is the one that was identified in the WHO recommendations, which is to test all the animals and remove those that are infected. This works very well in a country like Australia, where we could we can compensate farmers for the loss of that animal. And it took 20 years for Australia to eradicate brucellosis from its cattle herd. It's not feasible in Jordan. And then the One Health intervention, which is interestingly one of the more, it's the, in fact, it's dropped off the bottom, but it's essentially this bright red one. So this bright red line here in the middle of this graph is the One Health intervention. And the One Health intervention included some controls to movement of animals, culling or removing female sheep that suffered an abortion. So clinically affected animals were removed from the herd, and increasing awareness amongst people and changing the vaccine to a better vaccine. And what's interesting is that each one of those on their own don't have much of an impact, but when you put them together, they have quite a substantial impact. It's a much cheaper activity than testing and culling, and it has most likely the same outcome. So what's interesting after the model is that we really focus back on the assumptions and beliefs that are present in the recommendations. So in these recommendations, what we see with the WHO recommendations is largely they're not going to make any difference, because the country needs to actually manage the problem differently, and the way that they need to manage it is not present. In these recommendations, we don't have any suggestions to manage livestock production, the movement of animals, and the removal of clinically affected animals. So there's another, I've just included two graphs from this because I think if anyone's interested in some publications, I guess, that aren't infectious diseases, then there was a good publication with a model, and I put this in because it also shows you what you can do with these mathematical models. So this is a dashboard that's created by the program that we use to generate the model. And the wonderful thing about these dashboards is that they're a planning tool. So this is a planning tool provided. There's one of those stock and flow models behind it. And what we can do is we can sit down with a bunch of with different stakeholders, and we can run through and discuss with them what they would think is feasible to do. And we can change parameters to simulate different interventions. So in this particular one, they were simulating the changes over time of the number of suicides if we start to change the capacity of our mental health services. So if we can increase our assessment capacity, we achieve some things. If we increase our service capacity, we achieve others. So you can begin to construct and simulate these interventions. And this is essentially what they did. They basically looked at what combinations, and it's important to know that you can combine interventions and look at the combined effect. So they're looking at better service planning, better interventions. So this is a very cost-effective way of planning. So the final case study is, again, another one just to explore the move from epidemiology through to modelling. And this one's based on work that I've been doing with Fiji. So Fiji's a small country with less than 1 million people, 1 million people population. So, very small health system. They have a particular problem with leptospirosis, which originally, this is what we conceptualize leptospirosis. It's a bacteria, this little spirochete, that has cycles in different animal species, and then it spills over into people and potentially between people and dogs. So Fiji itself, as I said, it's an island nation, much the same as Indonesia. It has most of its population live on the main island, but the islands itself have different zones based on climate. There's a distinct difference between the western side and the eastern side of the island. But their burden is quite high, and I've seen data for Indonesia, and I think Fiji probably has a 2 or 3 times higher incidence and a 2 or 3 times higher death rate. So if you think of a population of less than 1 million people, they're up to sort of 15 to 30 people a year are dying from leptospirosis. As I said, the western side and the eastern side, this is the central division, have different climate. So they have a distinct wet season in the western part, but it rains most of the year for the central part. There's also a larger number of cases in males compared to females, largely because they're involved in agriculture. So epidemiology can begin to help us understand who and some of the what people are doing to be infected. So the Fijians, so the Itoke are the Fijians of Melanesian descent, and they're overrepresented because they live in communities that are more traditional and that have greater access to land and to agriculture. Cases tend to occur more in younger people, but the death is pretty much evenly across the age groups. So the determinants of mortality aren't necessarily related to age. So what we did was we took an approach of firstly starting with all the stakeholders. So we developed a couple of workshops. We went through a process of discussion and planning using what we would consider to be traditional planning tools. We developed a multi-sectoral strategy, and that led to an increase in health promotion focus on early presentation, because that was one issue, was that people present late for healthcare, and the other one was developing better clinical guidelines. So these two approaches are very much supported by the World Health Organization, because they tend to have a focus on the human health aspects. And in a public health setting, that is where we think the solutions lie. One of the problems we've got is that we continue to have cases of leptospirosis. So these responses, the new guidelines and the focus on health promotion, have not changed the number of cases, and they haven't changed the number of mortality events. So we began to look at what else we could do, and we started to look at weather. And in the western side, where there's a wet season, there is good evidence that rainfall is important. We can also start to think about temperature. So it's a temperature sensitive organism, so temperature matters. But then you begin to look more broadly and think, well, how else do we manage it? And again, public health tend to focus on the source. So we're focused on how do we control infection in livestock and rats, and we have less ability to control these other parts. These are weather events and people's engagement with water, agricultural activities, even down to things like waste management. And one of these three factors here are not covered really: the sewage, whether people have good water and sanitation, and whether they have good solid waste management. These were identified by stakeholders as really important, and yet we don't consider them in our public health framing. So there's been a move as well to think about leptospirosis as a soil organism, where the sort of environment becomes a reservoir. So rather than focusing on the animal as the reservoir, we start to think about the soil. So what we've done is then taken this approach and think, okay, so more holistically, what's happening? If we start with our case of leptospirosis, what do we think about the causes? So when we look at our traditional epidemiological data, we start to focus on who the people who are infected, so agricultural workers, so activities associated with soil and water become important, and the use of protective equipment. If we then focus on the environmental aspects, and so this is really then thinking about how does rainfall work, because rainfall is important in the epidemiology, and we see that with our epidemiological studies. And because it's an organism that can survive in soil, then as soon as we begin to insert these variables, we begin to think, well, how do organisms move from soil to water? And so what we're then focused on are things like runoff. So this is how the water flows across the land and how it takes contaminated soil and contaminated water and increases exposures that people have. So these are the main focus of people who are interested in the climate aspects, because that again is changing the way we view this problem. So then we start to think about where the animals are in the system, because really we're focused here on what the humans do, what the environment represents, and now we look at the animals. And so animal infections are important. The other aspects that were identified in meta-analyses and risk assessments are to do with infrastructure. So our drainage infrastructure, our solid waste management, the types of settlements. So informal settlements are unplanned, poorly supported peri-urban settlements, and they're driven by rapid urban growth. So all of these structures of how humans live make a difference. They also have an impact on animal populations, because the more people we have, the more dogs we have, the more rodents we have. And the more animals we have, the more infected animals we have, and that then feeds into this environmental system. So what we then think about is where do our control measures fit? And so we have rodent control measures and we have occupational health and safety. So again, we're starting to look at what these are actually doing in the leverage points. Where do they work and how do they work? And we then have our health services and issues like time to treatment initiation and health service access. How do they work? So, and basically their relationship with hospitalization. And I guess what we ended up with is this concept down the bottom, this forecasted risk. So is it possible to begin to actually give people more information? And would it have an impact? So the work for this is ongoing. We haven't finished. We're moving to now build a mathematical model. But I wanted to show this to, I guess, just as an illustration of where our traditional public health viewpoint is focused on animal sources, risk factors associated with contact with the environment and water, and health-seeking behaviour. What we don't include are some of the drivers like household income. We don't think much about infrastructure. So it's important that we begin to broaden our understanding of the problem. So what we come to the conclusion is that rainfall makes a difference because runoff's important. So we can begin to predict. The role of temperature is not exactly easy to work out. And the animal reservoir is not as important as we thought it was. But again, human behavior, it's a human system. So what we're interested now in is developing a model to see if we're able to start changing the way that the system works if we can provide specific information. We do need to ensure that education occurs, but it needs to be related to the activities and the belief systems of the people affected. And we also need to start considering whether there are engineering solutions to this. So I'll finish with just a sort of, I mean, there's an awful lot of information there, but essentially, hopefully you'd agree with me now that if we start to move away from this cause and effect, this mechanistic viewpoint, we'll begin to perhaps understand a bit better why things are occurring in our systems and how we may be able to sort of develop interventions that at least won't cause unintended consequences. And as I said, the main aim that I see of systems thinking is to help you understand which interventions are likely to be the least bad. It's not really easy to say we're going to find the best because it's always going to be a multiple interventions. And I'd stop there, but thank you. That was quite long, so hopefully everybody's still concentrating.
Thank you, Professor Simon, for the explanation. I think it's fine. We have a lot of new insights about the system thinking. And actually, we also have a subject called health system thinking for our students here in public health. So we find a lot of new perspective, a lot of new example about the system thinking, the importance of system thinking, especially in public health. Okay, so we go to the next session. It's the discussion session. I see there is still a lot of participants here in our Zoom meeting today. So please, if you have any question, you can just ask directly. You can raise your hand, open your mic, or you can also write it down in the chat. So, okay, so we have Ibu Dr. Dewi Susilawati. Ibu Dewi, please.
I want to ask about the how to improve ability and skill tip in public health training system, because system thinking is a highly relevant approach in strengthening in healthcare system, and how to improve, develop and skill about this?
Yes. So it's a good question. I guess on a personal level, most of the people who understand the practice of systems thinking work outside of the health sector. So I've been fortunate because of the university structure. We have colleagues in the business school who are systems modelers, and we were fortunate in receiving funding for a project on Clostridium difficile that involves the core of the project is the development of a systems model. So from a personal perspective, I was interested in it, and I taught myself and I learnt from others. There are courses and materials available. The World Health Organization has a website called Health Systems. It's again, I can put it in the chat or send it through later. But there's a website with some resources. There are some online training programs. They'll teach you some of the basics. There are also conferences there's an International Systems Modeling Society, I think it's called, and they run a summer school workshop for people who'd like to learn. But it's like everything, you know. To me, it was quite new. It's easy to think about how to do it. You know, you might understand that there are connections between things, but then learning the methodology is just the same as any other methodology. So from a personal point of view, if people are interested in learning, then there are some excellent books and some good online resources. From a institutional point of view, I've run several workshops with people, usually under the theme of One Health. And in One Health, one of the key competencies is systems thinking. I don't believe that people are doing it very well, but at least it's an entry point for talking to people about systems. And so when we teach One Health to our students, and when I run workshops, we do some basic modeling activities, drawing some basic, causal loop diagrams, those models. And we also do discussions about stakeholders. So I think the organizations have to be interested in doing it. And I think most of my colleagues that train government agencies, largely they talk about systems thinking as a decision support process or a decision support tool. So they run workshops to do strategic, they call it strategic decision making. And so they don't necessarily, so the government's not paying for a systems thinking workshop, it's paying for a decision making workshop. So it's important to sort of work out how we can engage others, because even students in my course who are working for government will say this is really, so far we're only halfway through, but they're already telling me how useful some of the tools are, particularly the collaboration tool, because of the work that this one student did. And then I've had other students who've said once they've left their masters and entered the workforce, they say it's been really valuable because now they see systems everywhere. So I think it's a slow process of people organically encouraging, because without a demand for training, it's very difficult to see how we can improve capacity. But there are some good resources, and I'll send them through.
All right, thank you, Professor Simon, for the answer. Can I have a few minutes to translate it and summary from the question and answers? Okay, so tadi Bu Dewi nanyakan tentang gimana kita meningkatkan gitu ya Bu, kemampuan kita dalam sistem thinking gitu ya Bu, dalam keseharian atau dalam pekerjaan kita. Dan tadi Profesor Simon menyampaikan bahwa sebenarnya ada kursesnya gitu atau pelatihannya yang terkait sistem thinking tadi. Jadi biasanya dari institusinya Profesor Simon juga ada menyampaikan materi-materi yang biasanya masuknya terkait dengan One Health. Tapi memang untuk meningkatkan kemampuan dalam sistem thinking itu membutuhkan waktu. Jadi tadi disampaikan itu it's a slow process gitu ya. Jadi tidak bisa langsung kuliah habis itu tiba-tiba master gitu, tidak bisa. Jadi ada proses-prosesnya dan memang bertahap gitu. So Professor, I think we can summarize that to learn about system thinking, it's not on we cannot only just learn from the courses, right? So we need to practice it because yeah, well, I know that it is quite easy to learn about the theory, but I think it's difficult to practice it in our daily lives, especially when our working with our colleagues, maybe, or before we making some decisions. Sometimes we are not we forgot that we need to learn about the system thinking first, and we need to think further before we make every decision. So we can see in the chat, Professor Simon had shared about the resources about system thinking from WHO. Or maybe all the participants can click on the link, or maybe you can save it if you want to learn more about the system thinking later. Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. Yeah, I've just put there's a couple of others. So.
Sure, great. Thank you very much. I think I'm also gonna learn more about it from your website that you shared here.
Yeah, it's good fun.
Okay, do you have any other participant that want to ask, or maybe you want to discuss? It's also fine. Maybe our students have, some differences when learning about system thinking in our faculty, and maybe from the Professor Simon explanation. Oh, we have Sekar here. Time is yours, Sekar.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. I actually just wanted to ask about maybe you have some type of circumstances where you try to apply the system thinking to a problem or a study where you actually do it by yourself or maybe with your students that remain unsolved, or it was already made in terms of the visualization, but then when you or maybe your students try to apply it, it gets even more complex to the point it's almost difficult to try to solve it. Have you ever encountered any of those? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's a good question. So so I guess at the moment, so the way we work is solving the problems we're working on are actually problems that almost don't have a solution. And that's one of the sort of, we know about, you will have known of wicked problems. And so when we talk about wicked complex problems, there's a definition that they don't have a solution. When we actually run models, you almost always will always have some. You'll never remove a problem to zero. Really, what we're usually trying to do is point out the improvements that can be made with changes to the system. And the difficulty is often that. So for us, we're using them as tools to communicate often with our government. And we've done one for a parasitic cause of gastroenteritis, Cryptosporidium. In Australia, that's a problem in swimming pools. So when people swim in summer in swimming pools, if a young child that has diarrhea has an accident in the pool and defecates, then anybody in that pool will become exposed. So we get very large outbreaks in summer. We'll have 1,000 cases across our summer. The government manages the quality of the water, so they specify what the water should be like, and they don't have the ability, because it's an environmental health unit, to manage the people. And so what our model demonstrated was that the guidelines they provide won't work because they don't target the most important part, which is the young child. And so what we've done is educated. So we've met with them and educated them and said, you know, there are some things that will work, but you've told, you know, their guidelines have 12 to 15 different activities and only really 1 or 2 of them will make a difference. So what we hope is that they will change their guidelines to be more specific, and that they will begin to think about maybe being, you know, increasing perhaps the regulation around swimming pools. So it is hard, and I guess what we're hoping is in the future is to have projects where we can develop a model and then develop interventions to test to see if they're improving. So we're not quite there yet. So it's not a very good answer. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Can I have a few minutes again? So tadi Ibu Sekar menanyakan terkait implementasi gitu ya Bu ya, tentang apa sistem thinking tadi yang sudah dilakukan oleh Profesor Simon, dan tadi dijelaskan bahwa sedang ada proyek terkait kualitas air di kolam renang dan kejadian diare. Tapi itu memang tadi yang disampaikan masalahnya ini almost impossible to solve gitu. Jadi sulit untuk ditangani, dan tapi yang dilakukan adalah gimana caranya meningkatkan kondisinya dulu. Jadi tidak langsung menyelesaikan masalah, tapi ditingkatkan dulu kondisinya secara bertahap, dan sedang dikembangkan modelnya juga dan guideline. Terus juga sudah didiskusikan juga dengan pemerintah setempat untuk memperbaiki guideline dan juga melakukan edukasi, dan diharapkan sih guideline-nya itu bisa lebih meluas gitu ke semua kelompok sasaran, terutama anak-anak yang sebenarnya itu berhubungan langsung dengan kejadian diare untuk di kolam renang tadi. Jadi masih dalam proses pengembangan. Itu Ibu Sekar, ada tambahan?
Sampun, terima kasih. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So in our chat, we have Ibu Cahya. Ibu Cahya is also one of the lecturers here in our Faculty of Public Health. So Bu Cahya asking about system thinking help us to analyze the problem and make solution. What is the best we start when we want to get the problem solution? Thank you.
Yeah. So what we in most of the modeling that we do, we try and work with the end user. So we have a project looking at that's developing a model to understand human exposures to bats. And for example, we have one of the participants in the project is part of the Queensland, the Department of Health. So I think for me, the process of modelling is very participatory. So the idea with a model is that you can't easily you can't build a model by yourself. So you need a group. And the best way of building it is to have the experts from the different parts of the system working together to help you build the model. And what we experience is that if we have some of the people who can provide the solution, then they're more likely to understand how they need to change their practice. We had one student working on stunting in children in Laos, and that's exactly what happened. They realized that the problem in Laos wasn't the biggest problem was the language barrier in areas where there were minority groups that didn't speak the national language of Laos particularly well. And so I think now the government is providing language training in Laos and also trying to work with local communities more directly to support relationships between community members rather than from the central main capital city, which is not part of the indigenous part of the ethnic minority. So I mean, I think to build a good model, you need the end users involved. And once you have them involved, then I think it's a lot easier to start thinking about solutions.
Okay, thank you Profesor Simon. Jadi yang disampaikan tadi untuk menyusun sebuah problem solution atau solusi dari suatu masalah, yang pertama kita harus mempertimbangkan dulu end usernya atau nanti masyarakat sasarannya itu seperti apa, karakteristiknya bagaimana, dan apakah bisa mengimplementasikan solusi tadi dibuat. Dan ketika menyusun proses modelingnya juga disarankan melibatkan banyak pihak gitu, banyak pihak dengan berbagai expert yang bervariasi supaya bisa berjalan tadi sistem thinkingnya. Jadi ada uh, banyak ahli gitu dari yang bidang-bidang yang lain juga yang bisa dilibatkan untuk menyusun sebuah masalah, sebuah solusi dari sebuah masalah. Thank you, Professor Simon.
Thank you.
And we still have a lot more in the
Yeah.
chat Zoom. So we have Mr. Nur Edi asking about referring to your slide regarding achieving integration in Table 1, about the characteristic of 3Cs. The implementation is often hampered by government bureaucratic regulation. Based on your experience, how to overcome this issue?
Yes, and that's another excellent question, because in the past, what my observation in certainly in Australia is we rely on personal relationships, and I think it's the same in Indonesia. So you can get good coordination if you have good personal relationships between people in different ministries or different organizations, and they trust each other and they communicate. What is interesting so the work we did in Fiji with leptospirosis, as long as the people who knew each other stayed in those organizations, then they worked really well together. If that relationship changed, if one person moved, then the relationship between the two organizations stopped. We have an example in Queensland. 3 years ago, we had an outbreak of Japanese encephalitis virus in pig farms and some farmers and people exposed to the area. This year, and one of the biggest problems they had was they didn't understand, or they couldn't share data. So as Noor points out, the government regulations prevent the sharing of data or sharing of information because of the of the law. And the organisations also, even if it's not under law, they often don't collect the right data. And so they had problems with communication that took a long time to solve. And then this year I discovered that in 2018, so many years before the outbreak, the government, the animal health and the human health agencies in departments in Queensland had signed a memorandum of agreement on sharing data and sharing information. So even when you have a legal agreement, the data still didn't get shared. So what we've discussed, we did an exercise in one class last year. So we actually discussed that just having an agreement isn't enough. You probably need to run annual planning workshops. You need to have some activity, you need to have responsibility, because even that is not enough. In Fiji, they have an antimicrobial resistance task force across the government, and legally the Permanent Secretary of Health and the Permanent Secretary of Agriculture have to provide representatives under the law, because all of the veterinary medicines actually come under the Health Act. So they have the ability to make sure that agriculture engages, and they won't do it because they see no benefit. So it's a really difficult problem. But what I've observed is that when we use systems thinking isn't the sort of solution to that, but the processes and the tools we use can help people see that if they truly want to solve a problem, they may need to make adjustments, and then the process often helps you work out what those adjustments are. because otherwise people will just say, oh, yes, we need a memorandum of understanding, but we know that's not enough. So it could be that they need to actually nominate people who meet every 3 months, and you force people to do it. I'm not sure. It's actually the topic of the project I'd like to be doing, is to try and work out how you do this, because we know it doesn't work in health either, particularly when you have non-health actors. So in Australia, we have a big tension between supermarkets and food companies and the nutrition sector. So it's very difficult.
Well, I think I can quite understand that about that, Professor, because we in our faculty we also have a lot of projects with the government from various district or city, like Prof. Marta in nutrition areas, Bu Ayun is related to immunization, and it is very difficult to work with the government, even though we know that we have the solution and we have the right model, but it's kind of hard to convince them to use our model, right, Bu Marta and Bu Ayun? And also about the data, I think we can agree that it's also happened in Indonesia. Sometimes they have the data, but they don't want to share it for us, even though we already have the agreement or the policy about that we can access the data. And sometimes they share the data, but the data is sometimes it's quite manipulated or something, and it's not right. And also how they collect the data is kind of not reliable, so we cannot 100% believe about the validity of the data. So yeah, it's really hard to working about the health, especially or public health, especially in a lot of areas. So,
Okay, so we all have the same problem.
Yes, we are.
Well, and that's why it's and that's the thing. So to me, systems thinking isn't a solution on its own. It's a way of involving people in the development of understanding, and then using that understanding to work to direct people's focus to where they should work together, and to try and get them away from areas that are not going to be productive. I see that with zoonotic diseases, because we focus so much on the animals, because that's the way that public health thinks, is we ignore the most important parts, which is what the humans are doing. And I see it all the time. They say this is not our problem. Or, I've had the WHO representative say that all this One Health is fantastic for leptospirosis, but all we have to do is treat people better, and treat our clinical cases better, and we will save more lives. So we did a review of 500 case files and basically demonstrated that nothing any of the clinical teams did made a difference to the outcome in terms of mortality. And that's because people were they were presenting too late, and the health system, it took too long for them to be diagnosed. So by the time they were diagnosed, it was too late. Their outcome was already determined. And so the mindset of the WHO was just completely wrong. They had a personal problem with collaboration and One Health. So
yeah, there's a lot of problems in various aspects related to public health. Bu Ayu, mungkin ada yang ditambah sampaikan?
Yes, okay. I want to ask, may I ask, Mbak Dia?
Yep.
Okay,
Sure.
Prof. Simon Reid, it is not easy matter if we must analyze all related elements, especially when we face with limited resources and organization. Please explain how to deal with such situation. In the concept of system thinking, is there a minimum limit of the number of elements that must be analyzed? Similar to the picture shown in your presentation, the more elements to analyze, the picture is more rich. Okay.
Yeah.
And we all know that resources limitations itu are an obstacle or an constraint of the organization. Organization have limited resources. No, I mean, is there a minimum limit of the number of elements that must be analyzed? I mean, a limited elements for each case. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for Ray.
Okay.
Mr.
So
Ray.
yes, because it's a good point. So we did do an exercise last year with a mixed group of people where we tried to go through the process of building a very small model. And I think we limited them to 12 or 15 elements. And it was very difficult because it was the first time they had done it. And so I think for me, it was useful for most people, but I think some of them became frustrated. So when you force people to do it, it's very difficult. You can also, so those types of tools that we use, I guess, are not the only systems tools. Some of the exercises we've done with the systems thinking iceberg, which is sort of the 4 levels where you observe your problem and then your immediate causes and then the underlying causes and then your mental models and beliefs. What I found is that itself is really useful because it forces people to try and think about some of the factors that they might not be taking into account. And the principal reason you do one is systems thinking is to get people to think differently. So we don't need to go to a model. It's useful to go to a model. We also achieved a lot last year with, we did a national set of workshops around the National Action Plan for Antimicrobial Resistance. And we used a technique called empathy mapping, which it's like a stakeholder mapping exercise that you do yourself. And it's done with professional development workshops. And again, I can share the process. And it was really interesting because all we asked them to answer was, who are we? So what's our group? What do we think? What do we say? What do we hear? What do we see? And what do we do? So who are we as stakeholders? And then what are our problems? And what are the good, what are our pains and what are our gains? So what are the things that are difficult and what are the things that we can achieve? And we had done that as a workshop for our school. And when we did it with our stakeholders, for example, we had some health stakeholders. So they were clinicians and pharmaceutical representatives. And they just said, we just realized that every decision that is made in health is focused inwards on the patient. So we don't take into account the consequences of our decisions on anybody else because the patient is so important. And they had never realized that. And then we talked to the animal health people and they said, well, that's interesting because we look outwards because everybody's looking in at us and telling us we're the problem. So we're defensive and we're reactive. And we also have to manage we respond to our stakeholders because they're the ones that pay us our salary. And then the environment sector, which is the waste management, said, well, we look at both of you because you're giving us problems. And to us, you're a future risk. So what's interesting is from that point, the discussion in the room changed because suddenly everybody understood the perspective of the other. So that's it. So they're thinking. So what we managed to achieve was we shifted their belief system. We shifted their assumptions, and so even that simple exercise, which took 30 or 40 minutes, allowed us to get a different set of responses from the room. So I'd encourage, and that's where there's, people do focus on the model building exercises, but what we've experienced is just getting people to understand who they are and how they think is a really, really valuable thing.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Nate.
Welcome.
Thank you, Professor, for the answers. Yeah, I think it's quite great discussion we have today. Do we also have another participant that want to ask or maybe discuss something with Professor Simon about today's topic? Maybe you can raise your hand or write it down in the chat. No? Okay. So I think we have enough discussion for today, Professor Simon. Before we close the session, do you have any, maybe closing statement or something that you want to say for our participants for today's?
I'm not sure. I've said an awful lot. I think the only thing I would say is that even if you don't agree with modeling and the people don't think they can move towards thinking about how to get people to develop causal loop diagrams. If there's ever an opportunity to attend system thinking workshops or read material, it's really about thinking and trying to learn to think differently. And I think even if people take away from this that we really do need to think more broadly and think outside our own influence. And that might include, if we're interested in understanding food policy, well, maybe go and meet with food producers, understand why commercial food production is done the way it is. I think it ends up with a richer discussion so that you understand another person's perspective. So that's one of the aims.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Simon, for today's session. Thank you also for all the participants here. And before we close today's session, maybe I can give you some conclusion about today's meeting. So system thinking is important to consider before we make every decision or policy, because no matter what our decision is, it will impact both direct impact and also indirect impact, especially in public health, because every decision would affect various of aspects. And also do not forget to look for the bigger picture before making any decision. And also system thinking is something that we need to learn and practice, but it is a slow process to improve it. So when we need to create a model to solve a problem, we need to collaborate with other experts, government, and also the end users. So we can practice the system thinking process to create the model for the problem solution. And it is also important to involve the government, like what we have discussed before, to create the solution and maybe force them to involve and make them understand why is it important to develop the model using the system thinking. And also maybe we can force them to see the benefit of this model so they can accept our model that developed by the system thinking process. And I think that's all for today. Before we close, thank you very much for all of the participants for joining today's session. I hope we get a lot of benefits and also new insights about the system thinking, especially in public health. Thank you, Bu Ayun, for giving me the opportunity to learn and also for conduct as the moderator. Thank you also for Prof. Marta for organizing the event so we can learn a new perspective about the system thinking from Professor Simon. And thank you also for all the staff that helping behind the scene to make sure that today's event running smoothly. Last but not least, thank you for all the participants. And I can see a lot of students here from the undergraduate, from the master and also doctoral program, or maybe some alumni. And also I see some lecturers here also joining our today's session. I hope we all get the benefit from today's lecture. And also thank you for Professor Simon for the insightful presentation today. We hope we can, collaborate more maybe in the future for maybe research or publication and other stuff, because through Professor Marta maybe because we have a lot of project coming in our faculty and we need a lot of experts to collaborate for our projects here. And thank you very much for everyone here. And I'm sorry if I have any mistakes during the session. Terima kasih. Saya akhiri today's session. Terima kasih. Saya akhiri kegiatan hari ini. Selamat siang. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Professor Simon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Professor
you.
Simon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ibu Marta. Jangan lupa ya nanti teman-teman untuk presensi ya yang tadi yang mahasiswa
Okay.
sudah adminnya. Bye.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Professor. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Saya mengingatkan kembali seluruh peserta, silahkan mengisi daftar hadir yang tadi sudah di-share di chat. Dan tadi bisa disimpan mungkin yang link-link yang sudah di-share oleh Profesor Simon. Terima kasih.
Nggak ada foto, sesi foto bersama, ada nggak?
Oh iya, tadi lupa ya.
Sudah saya.
Tapi kayaknya sudah ya, Mas Riyadi.
Udah, oh, udah
Oke, ya
sudah.
sudah.
Ya.
Oke, ya. Makasih ya Bu Dian.
Terima kasih Bu Dian.
Terima kasih Bu Marta.
Cahya.
Bu Cahya.
Terima kasih teman-teman yang lain ya.
Supaya
Yuk, sampai ketemu
Ini
lagi.
nggak apa-apa ditutup sekarang?
mulai sekarang kalau segala sesuatu harus berpikir sistem ya.
Iya. It's
Oh
not
ya, itu terutama
easy,
buat
tapi ya.
mahasiswa itu ya. Mahasiswa itu berpikir sistem itu harusnya tuh ya kan. Itu Mas Septian tuh yang
Ya,
ya.
buat kita juga gitu ya.
Iya.
Ya, matur nuwun
Ya
semuanya.
Bu, matur nuwun.
Ye, matur nuwun. Matur nuwun
Ye.
semuanya. Ye.
Nah, live ya. Izin live.